If you're a bluegrass slash folk slash country musician like I am, you may find yourself scratching your head when you see chords like these. The overall term we use to describe these chords is extended chords. In my video series on hearing chord changes, I mentioned that there are three main types of chords that we as folk musicians need to know, that being major, minor, and seventh chords, more specifically dominant seventh chords. In this video, we'll offer some fingering suggestions for guitar, mandolin, and banjo for some of the more common extended chords you might come across. At the same time, we'll also fill you in that you can often use just a simple chord that you already know as a substitution. Basic chords are first formed as triads, groups of three notes. This is easier to see on a piano keyboard. Here is the C major chord. Notice how we skip every other white key and end up with the notes C, E, and G, the first, third, and fifth notes of the scale. When we put these triads onto stringed instruments with multiple strings, we often end up doubling up some of the notes. Here on this C chord on guitar, I have C, E, G, and then another C and E. Let's now extend our every other note in the scale concept to also include the seventh note. Because the seventh note we're adding comes from the major scale, we refer to this chord as C major 7. To get the C major 7th on our guitar, we need to add the note B. The unusual thing on a stringed instrument is sometimes in order to add a note, you remove a finger. That's the case here. Take your first finger off, you'll have your open B string that you add to your C chord, and there's your C major 7. An example of where you've heard this C major 7 before is in the Eagles song Best of My Love. They started with the C major 7 and hammered into the C chord. For those of you that are old enough, you may remember this song from the 60s that used a couple of major 7th chords. Don't let the sun catch you crying. An easy concept to figure out how to form major 7th chords is to find the highest root note in the chord, in this case the C, and lower it a half step, 1 fret, which in this case becomes an open string. We did the same thing when we had our F chord. We took this F and turned it into the open E string. When doing your D chord, here's your D note, back it up 1 fret, half step, you end up needing to use a bar to create the D major 7. So try that concept with different chords. It won't work for all of them, but many of them it will. This same concept of lowering the high root will work on your mandolin as well. Here's a G chord, here's the high G note, drop it a half fret, you have to borrow these two notes. There's your G major 7. You've heard that in another Eagles song. Here's an F chord. Take off the first finger and add the E note, F major 7. If you use this A chord, lower this high A note, you'll have to cover 2 strings with your third finger. There's a movable major 7th chord. Move it up 1 fret. You have B flat major 7. If you lower the root of your C chord, simple C, yeah, it sounds sort of like the major 7, but it also looks exactly like an E minor chord. So at that point, because I didn't have a second C root, I add the C root right here. And I can even bring in the G note up here on the first string. And that becomes another movable chord. Here's C major 7, 2 frets higher, D major 7. Once again, the same concept works on your 5-string banjo tuned to standard G. Take your high G note, move it down to F sharp. You have to rearrange your fingers. But at that point you have your major 7th. It's a movable form. G major 7, A major 7, B flat. It's very important to know that a regular 7th chord cannot be exchanged for a major 7th chord. And that's because the major 7th chord has this very mellow feeling to it, whereas a regular 7th introduces a lot of what's called tension. So you could substitute a regular major chord for the major 7th. So you don't know G major 7, just play your G. The other people playing the major 7th along with your G, all the notes will blend in and everything will be fine. Let's now go back to our regular dominant C7 chord. And the word dominant refers to how this chord wants to dominate the progression. It wants to tell you where to go after this chord. The tension of that chord is seeking a release. In this case, it finds it with an F chord. If you've ever seen chords that look like these, they are all extensions of the dominant 7th chord. The 9 refers to adding the note that is 9 notes in the scale up from the root, which happens to be the same letter name as scale degree 2, but implies that the 2 notes will not be placed or heard side by side, but rather 9 notes apart. The guitar fingering for our C7 chord is actually missing a G note. So it has the C, E, and the B flat. And then we get another C and an E. This is actually still enough to define this chord as the C7 chord. To make a 9th chord out of this, we'll take this C note and move it up to D, and in the process, we'll end up borrowing our 3rd finger across 3 strings and we'll pick up that missing G. So this form has all 5 notes of the 9th chord. And it's a movable form. There's C9, move it up 2 frets, D9, and so on. Being that the 9th chord is an extension of the regular dominant 7th chord, it has that same effect. It just adds a little more tension and it wants to be released. Being that a mandolin has only 4 different strings, we have an inherent problem in trying to create chords that have 5 different notes. Through observing great players, it has become generally accepted that to replicate the sound of a 9th chord, you need to have at least the 3rd, the flat 7, and the 9th of the chord. Notice we didn't stress that you even had to have the root of the chord. So to form a G9 chord, you could get by with just the notes B, F, and A. And to test to see if this really works, see if the tension of this G9 chord wants to resolve up a 4th to a C chord. And indeed it does. We can further develop our G9 chord by getting this open G into the chord. And then we would have the notes F and B all the way up to the A up here on the 1st string. If we trade the A note off of the 1st string with the G note off of the open 4th string, we come up with a chord that looks like this. All of the strings are fretted now, so we have a movable 9th chord, G9, A9, and so on. Here's the G9 chord on the banjo. All 4 strings are covered, so it's movable. Here it is as a C9. And these 9th chords, being that they're functioning like 7th chords, you hear a lot of those in blues and some rock. So you could take and move those chords around. And pretty soon you'll be feeling all right. Taking our 9th chord and extending it even further, we could come up with an 11th chord, but those chords are very rare, so we'll skip right up to the 13th chord, which you're far more likely to see. The complete 13th chord has a total of 7 notes, so even guitar players with their 6 strings have to decide just which are the must-have notes to sound the 13th chord. It turns out that again we need the 3rd, flat 7, and 13th of the chord. So here's the form on guitar that is commonly used. Has all 3 of those notes plus the G root. Still has the dissonant sound of the 7th plus the 13th. 13th meaning that this note is almost 2 octaves higher than the root. Being that you could also have the 9th of the chord in there, you could bar your pinky on the last 2 strings and pick up the A note that would create another 13th chord, but with a little more sound to it. So keep in mind, if you see a 9th chord, a 13th chord, and you don't know how to play it, you could always use the regular dominant 7th. Therefore, if you see a D13, you could just play a D7. You would have enough of that tension to make it sound like the chord that's being asked for. We'll now take a look at the last of the 3 main chord types that we're likely to face as a folk musician, that being the minor chords. The most common variation of a minor chord or extension that you'll see is that of the minor 7th. If we think of the notes of the minor 7th chord relative to the major scale, we would have a root, flat 3rd, 5th, and flat 7. For guitar players, this creates another situation where you're going to subtract a finger in order to add a note. If you play your A minor chord like this, you would lift up your 3rd finger to reveal the open 3rd string G. It's important to remember that you're trying to keep that mellow minor sound, but with a little more tension. Here's that same A minor 7 on mandolin. You'll see diagrams of this where people use actually all 4 fingers, fingers 1, 2, 3, 4. I choose to bar these 2 strings, strings 4 and 3, and then bar strings 2 and 1 with my 3rd finger. A minor 7, it's a movable form, B minor 7. On the banjo, find your minor chord. This is an A minor. I have 2 A notes on the outside strings. So I'll take this top one and lower the whole step 2 frets. That gives me the flatted 7th, so now I have the complete A minor 7 chord. And again, that will be movable. If you understand how to change a major chord to a minor chord by locating the 3rd of the chord and lowering it 1 fret, a half step, you can take the same concept with your extended chords. So we previously saw this D9 chord here at the 4th fret. This is the 3rd of the chord, so if I can stretch my finger down to here, I have a D minor 9. Very nice, mellow, jazzy minor 9th chord. If you're looking for an easy way out, when you see an extended minor chord, you can just play the minor chord of the same name. One final thing to share before we wrap it all up, and that is that the style of gypsy jazz rhythm playing involves using chords that are defined with just 3 notes. That came about because Django Reinhardt, the great gypsy jazz player, only had use of 3 of his fingers. So he would have to define his 7th chord with just a root, the flatted 7th, and a 3rd. Minor 7th, move that 3rd down. So those jazzy chords that you hear them playing are played with only 3 notes. In this video, we didn't address any chords that look like these. These, where you see a minus sign or a plus sign, they're known as altered chords, and that would be a whole nother topic for another video. Keep in mind that in some forms of folk music, these extended chords that we've been going over are considered outside the norm and sometimes are frowned upon, so be careful you don't want to see these guys show up at your jam. Realize that you can always rely on plan B, which is to play the simple version of whatever that extended chord is. At the same time, you may want to keep working on this stuff so that you can extend yourself and boldly go where no one has gone before.